Welcome to Behind the Podium, Unveiling the Coach. Problem solvers have problems too. So here at Behind the Podium, I, Jared Cohen, and my co-host Alexander Ellis discuss the struggles, philosophies, demands, and practices of the coach, or said more broadly, health and wellness practitioner. To provide quality coaching is to enhance someone's life in an everlasting and unfolding way. This is not easy and requires a lot of due diligence and self-mastery on the part of the coach to be able to perform. So without further ado, join us as we dig deeper into the depths of the coach's mind. Hello, Behind the Podium. I am Jared Cohen. Join with me,
Alexander Ellis.
And we are back to chat all things coaching related in the movement space or even beyond, thinking more philosophical. How does the coach interpret, manage, and make use of just the wealth of information that's out there for their own sake, and then how they can use that in service of the people that they're serving?
Mm-hmm. Gosh, there's so much stuff out there. I mean, you just think of like blogs and you search one topic and you get 500 different, articles about it, and yet none of them are referencing anything. And I'm like, who's telling the truth? I can't tell.
Yeah, and it's always daunting because I just always feel like if, as the coach, right, like we're having trouble navigating the truth, then empathetically, like, man, the clients, it's like, it's brutal. And I think part of it is good that, that's why it's so important that we're in the trenches, and we can empathize with that experience. Like, look, like I too am trying to figure this out, and there are a lot of mixed messages. I had a conversation this morning with a client who was just speaking to that very fact of different coaches telling her different things, and just how cumbersome that becomes. And in a place where so often we're just trying to take action, I feel like there's nothing more paralyzing than mixed messages.
Oh, totally. Well, even if you think, I don't know, maybe 10, 15 years ago, there wasn't just like not only the amount of information, but everything accessible at every minute to you. Like let's say you read a book about a certain thing back then. Well, then you would be marinating with that same author and their point of view until you finish the book. And now it's like, okay, I'm reading a book, and then I get an email from somebody that says something totally counter to that. And then you're on Facebook and something is like completely counter to that. And it's like this instant, constant need to filter through the BS. But then also, I mean, I think, because I feel this way, is sometimes I get hijacked from all the information. And when you're coaching and teaching from a client-centered place, it doesn't really matter what you read and what somebody else says if that doesn't work for the person in front of you.
Yeah, and I think that client-centered concept, which we talked about last time, is potentially one of the saving graces to hold on to as the coach when you are feeling overwhelmed with all this stuff. Because ultimately, where the client is at is pretty far from the depths that you have gone or that you're currently at, trying to figure out the nuances. I remember a couple years ago, I was going to do some nutrition coaching with this female client that has, she had rheumatoid arthritis, I believe. I don't think she had MS, but I remember, like, in anticipation for it, I got Terry Wall's book and Terry Wall's has MS, and for those of you who don't know, she became kind of internet famous because of a TED talk that she did back in 2007 or 8. It was actually pretty early within the paleo scene that cited this more ancestral diet as being a huge saving grace for her, that actually took her out of a wheelchair.
Wow.
And has since, is actually very scientifically involved. She is a doctor herself. So anyway, I bought her book in anticipation of working with this client to just kind of have more of that context, and I made it a point to like almost read most of it before I met with the client, and then it's just like it was just funny because meeting with the client, like the lowest hanging fruit was like just take soda out of the diet. It's like
right.
and here I am like really like in preparation thinking about like the nuances that Terry Walls is speaking to, that's of somebody that has more of an autoimmune condition versus just general,
like
paleo.
No garlic and no this and
yeah, right. Like those types of things. Because here I'm thinking like, okay, like this person, like we need to really get in there, and then it's like, no, like
you have to meet people where they're
yeah,
at.
totally. And so that I think is just one of those like reality check moments for the coach, and getting some distance from the depths of the debates related to the content versus the general context of someone's general well-being, and they're them just looking for a couple habits to make a little bit of a difference gradually.
And, I was thinking for us and all the information out there, like even research studies, you don't get funding and go about a research study without already pretty much knowing the answer and like what you're going to find.
Yeah.
And so there's all these studies that they do have like counter results that, don't necessarily agree with everything. It's like, well, which is true? I don't know, because the person in front of me is a unique and wonderful snowflake with their own experiences and their own junk and their own environment, and it all just depends. It depends.
Got to keep that constant.
I think I might just tattoo that on my forehead, because for every question I'm ever asked, the response could be, well, it depends.
It's true. We gotta start there.
So you sent me some really interesting stuff in preparation for today's talk, which kind of blew my mind, because one of the things you sent me was a video it's called the sissy squat progression. And a sissy squat, which I didn't know until I watched this video, is when you do basically a squat on your toes, right?
Yeah, you're essentially you're pretty much loading the knees.
Yeah.
The majority of the load is going into the knees in order to continue to lower your center of gravity.
Mm-hmm. So it's kind of like if you were to squat down while wearing high heels, except that muscularly you're fully supporting yourself. You're not
Correct.
propped up with any tools.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I used to teach this like when I first started teaching yoga, because my teacher taught that too. And I always thought it was so hard. It was so hard for people, but I didn't really have the context around like what we were actually doing.
Yeah.
And so you brought up this interesting idea of the progression of maybe like the focus of training, you could describe it as, like what we were doing 10 years ago. Well, maybe I guess what they were doing, not us.
Yeah. Right.
Do you want to talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah. So what I was thinking was like, so anyway, you got the sissy squat. This video is from Dewey Nielsen, who, if you don't follow on Instagram, is a recommended follow. Good content. And he's a movement. I think a really good example of someone that I would consider a movement teacher. He's not married to any one approach, and his context is very much movement. And so he's in this video doing a progression for this movement of this sissy squat, and it got me thinking about this timeline as it relates to, let's just say, the squat, and then it can extrapolate out from that. But if we just think about the squat, I feel like pre-2000s in the fitness scene anyway, like the squat was seen as a big no-no. And if you were to do it, even just like a couple of years ago, if you go back to like the general, men's health, women's health type of, CBS magazines, and you flip through and you look at like how they're diagramming the squat, that person's hips are usually like never going anywhere near or below parallel. You're like, really staying at that 90 degrees of hip flexion. The purpose always being kind of this mainstream understanding of like squats are bad for your knees, right? That there was that focus on the knees. And then
your knees are worn out. It must be all those squats you're doing.
It must be those squats. The doctor, even the MD was big on promoting on being on the no squat bandwagon. And then post 2000s, I think CrossFit is a big component of this. The squat, like it's the revival. It's much like, squat and saturated fat, like their comebacks, and I think that's also
avocados while squatting.
Yeah. And I think that's also why, like, the paleo movement married so well with the CrossFit movement, right? It really was like this kind of like, hey, like this stuff is important. It's a part of our background. It's a part of our evolution. It's, that word primal. But I think then even with that, right, you had a very strong focus on like, okay, the squat is back, but it's back with stipulations, right? Like that we're defending the squat based on the proper way to squat. And even with that, you have some ideas of like, okay, you gotta take the weight back in the heels, right? Which is like totally anti what the sissy squat is showing. You have to, then there's this concept of load ordering. Whatever we load first loads maximally. So we got to make sure we're loading those hips and hamstrings, that posterior chain, yada, yada, yada. And then I think like presently where we're at now, like just like this huge kind of jump in the timeline where it's like, now, not only do we want you just doing this, not only is there a discussion about doing it correctly, but there's this sort of new discussion of like doing something incorrectly, correctly. So
there's some air quotes on that one.
There's some air quotes on that. Yeah. With the idea being that you will always regret not training the position you got injured in. Yeah. And what it means to actually have tissue and movement resiliency to go into these positions that otherwise are or that are inherently not as stable.
Yeah, it's like nothing is off the table now.
Yeah. Which is kind of scary.
No, I know. Well, when you sent me that video, I was like, oh, hells no, I'm not going to do that. Like, that's crazy. But yeah, it's so true. It's like you're always going to, if you do get injured, regret where you don't go. And I think it's also important to clarify that this is in no means saying like, oh, forget a regular squat. You should only be practicing sissy squats.
Exactly.
It's not, because people do so much of the same thing over and over and over again, that having proper form is important because of the repetitive loading and, how many load cycles do you want to go through before catastrophic failure, which I would like to be unlimited. And so this weird loading or doing things incorrectly, but now there's like a proper form for the incorrect way. Yeah. But it's just about moving in as many ways as possible so that nothing's off the table as far as, what's available to your body. I was just reading Dr. Kathy Dooley. Her website is Dooley Noted. And she is...
That's a good name.
I know. Do you read any of her stuff?
No, I haven't.
Oh, you should. She's really cool. She is the kettlebell queen. She travels with like a 45-pound kettlebell.
Wow.
And one time she posted, she's like, so American Airlines lost my kettlebell. I think it was American. Sorry if it wasn't, but like an airline lost her kettlebell. And she's like, can you please explain to me how one misplaces a 45-pound kettlebell? But she's
Wow.
all about natural movement and barefoot training and all of that stuff. And one of the things she was saying with plantar fasciitis and all of the protective measures we put on the foot to keep it from, over pronating and doing this,
Yeah, right.
like potentially be causing a problem. And that internal rotation is something that people are missing a lot of the time, and the knee and the foot pay the price. And internal rotation, like, with squats and, hip motion, that's something that's been left off the table for so long, but it's a range of motion that we were born with. Right. And the fact that we don't have it in adulthood is not because you no longer need it. It's because we don't practice it.
Totally. And I think that doves nicely with Katie Bowman's nutritious movement concept. This aspect of the necessary nutrients that we need and only get from the variety of range. I think to your point too, which you said earlier about what is the amount of repetitions you're doing. I think also with a lot of these movements like the squat, now that it's sort of like won back the community, in some ways I'd argue it's like almost being over programmed to the extent that like, even if you are doing it within the kind of like within the parameters of correctness, you still are biasing that same way that you are doing it, right? That like, and after a while, like the body is just getting used to that one pattern. And so that it sort of like the body is no longer getting the same nutritious value from that food anymore. And so like compensations, I feel like end up happening inevitably, even if you are sort of still within kind of the correct patterns, just because of your own way in which kind of your asymmetries have married within this movement.
Yeah, adaptation always occurs. Our bodies adaptation are always so efficient.
And I think the other thing, like you said, to keep in mind with the sissy squat, it's like, one that's not saying like this is the only way to squat. Nor is it really, nor is it saying like, if you're going to squat with load, this is the way to do it. But it's also not saying that you can't squat that way with load, right? To a degree. It's rather pointing out, like, I think actually asking the question, why can't you do this? Right? Like, let's first ask the question, can you do this? And I think another prereq that maybe is not mentioned in just the video of like progression is like, I would think is like, do you have full ankle range of motion? Right. Because if you don't, the sissy squat is kind of
not happening.
Or like it's a poor version of it is happening every time you try to squat the other way, right? Yeah. So like
the people who can't keep their heels down.
People can't keep the heels down, right? It's and that's what I think is interesting about this. It's this bringing back like the intent, right? Like, what are you trying to accomplish? And I think that point really needs to be anchored within a lot of the conversations that are happening more now about the backlash of like it's like you can't be neutral all the time, and it's like, no, you can't. And no, it's not always necessary. But what I think we are mainly talking about regarding this neutral spine thing is like, we don't want you to get out of neutral if it's a compensation, right? Like neutral is fine, or not neutral is fine. Flexion or extension of the spine is fine if that's the goal, right? If like that's the intent of training. So same thing, if you're going to do the sissy squat, that's fine, but that's different than like you ending up in a sissy squat position because you're unable to do this normal squat correctly.
Totally.
And so what kind of struck me thinking about this from just the coach's perspective is like, this is a whole nother can of worms, to think about of like, well, when do I bring this in with clients, right? Because I think it is it is good food for thought, this idea of like, well, what if I do have clients that do really tend to, their weight does shift forward a lot, and or maybe they're in some job that requires them to kind of, bend down a lot, in which they are, in their toes, like, and I want them to kind of build some resiliency here. At what place does this have? And how do I start thinking about this inclusively with the other stuff that I want to program?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no movement is illegal.
Yeah.
But like you're saying, what's the purpose? And it depends. But, I think too, like in the shoulders and internal rotation, and the way I teach any upper body loading is to be externally rotated in the shoulders, especially when going into flexion, because that overhead position, that's a very stable position for the shoulder to be. That's not to say that having your shoulders overhead and internally rotating is illegal, but it's probably not the best place where you'd want to load in a handstand or put a barbell overhead. And then, yeah, like you're saying, but we can train there smartly and intelligently, but having it be our default is not an excuse for like, oh, that's okay. No, it's not okay.
Right. Yeah. And like, it sort of begs the, I think it comes back to this concept of like movement prep, and where, and with that, what are the prerequisites for certain things? So not only are we talking about progressions, which I think, what was nice with this video is it's like, hey, sissy squat progressions, right? Mm-hmm. Like, we're not just saying like, oh, here's the sissy squat, now go do it, right? I didn't program like, 4 rounds, 30 sissy squats and a 400-meter run, so there's that aspect, right? That there's many levels of the progression, but then I think the other conversation is the prerequisite. So one, thing I mentioned was, do you have full ankle range of motion, to not compensate into a sissy squat when that is not the intent, right. Is the first thing. But then thinking about that in other places is like the crab walk, I think is a good example of.
That's where you're like, or is that the duck walk? What's a crab walk?
So I'm taking now to the shoulder. So the crab walk, where your arms are behind you, the shoulders in extension.
You're kind of like a tabletop, reverse tabletop.
Yeah, reverse tabletop.
Okay.
And like that's another one that I think really goes overlooked, especially when we know how little time the average population spends with their arm behind them, right? Like shoulder extension, and then coupled with internal rotation, is more precarious. That's not to say that crab walking is bad, but again, also thinking, if I'm doing a group class, what is the sort of lowest common denominator of ability to even get into that position? Mm-hmm. What's interesting to me is how I think like something like the sissy squat in like a CrossFit space would like immediately be seen as a no-no, but like mm-hmm. crab walks are happening all the time, especially as like a warm-up exercise. Right. And yet I would argue that the two are very similar in what is required of one to be able to get there in the first place and do it successfully. Because we all know that like everyone technically can sissy squat, right? It's like we said, it's the default, like when you can't keep your heels down. And it's also like the ways in which most people move, if they're going to lower themselves down. It's the way in which we've lost the capacity to have such good hip range of motion, like, right. babies do, right? And just more naturally kind of stay on their heels and drop down. It's like that most common compensation. So to look at it as like, hey, it's not now, let's like kind of remove it from this category of like bad compensation, take it out and actually say like, well, what is like of use to actually train here, so that it doesn't just become like, kind of the X factor, to avoid. Similarly, right? Like how do we apply that concept to something like the crab walk, where
I was going to say the crab walk requires a ton of shoulder extension, which most people, if you had them do it just standing, they don't have.
Right, exactly, yeah. And the kind of like controlled articular rotation is a good example of that. like people just get lost of like being able to put their arm behind their back and internally rotate. And so for me, like for a coach to so quickly kind of be like, okay, guys, like, I want you to do some crab walks and bear crawls, right? Is um, is dangerous, right? Like for lack of a better term. And I think the same caution needs to be placed generally there and elsewhere as it would, I think, for someone that, may see the sissy squat and think like, oh God, like, keep your heels down.
Right.
And so being able to kind of connect the dots of what are these prerequisites and where is somebody, like where are you meeting someone, right? Like how we started. What is someone's baseline capacity? What is their experience with movement? And something we've talked about before, the layered effect of coaching, right? Like if I know I'm going to be doing a lot of squatting or stuff requiring the recruitment of the posterior chain, it maybe doesn't make sense for me to bring in sissy squats that day because It's going to be so different than the more frequent context that I'm going to want the client to connect with.
Yeah. Well, and also if the sissy squat, a squat with your heels up off the ground is your default, I don't need to train you there because you already know how to do that. Let's refine full ankle range of motion, full hip range of motion, and get you out of your compensation patterns.
Exactly. Yeah.
What you said about the bear crawls, I just taught a class this past week where that was our peak pose.
Oh,
so
cool.
We spent an hour and 15 minutes getting there. And there was a ton of context about shoulder position in 90 degrees of flexion before we even go all the way overhead, and how to prepare your shoulders and how to keep your shoulders integrated into your core regardless of what range of flexion they're at. So by the time we got to bear crawls, an hour and 15 minutes later, the whole story was there. It wasn't a warm up.
Right. Totally. Yes. I just did. I had the class do what I saw referred to as like a ninja crawl, which is basically like you're doing bear crawls, but you have a PVC pipe across your low back. So the idea being that you have to crawl without the PVC pipe tipping off or falling off your back.
Are the knees bent at like 90?
Yeah.
And hovering off the ground?
Yeah.
Okay.
So less of like the kind of downward dog position, more of your, more of like the moving tabletop.
Right.
And I think, like what I liked about that was just the immediacy of demanding control, and getting people to realize like, what's going on? Like, why is this pipe not staying on my back? And for me, the takeaway is like, for coaches to be more cognizant of like, what are these type of exercises that maybe we take for granted that we need to kind of like tune up, right? So that it's the movement becomes more diagnostic, not only for you as the coach, but for the client, right? That like, all of a sudden this bear crawl that someone took for granted becomes very different when they have to balance something on their low back.
Demands are higher for perfection.
Yes, yeah. Raise the stakes.
Literally raise the bar.
Yeah, yes.
What's interesting too about crawling, because I've been teaching crawling lately, is cross patterning and the inability of people to connect with that cross pattern that, my right hand and my left knee need to move forward, and then my left hand and my right knee need to move forward. And it's just, it's definitely one of those super humbling realizations that like, oh my God, I don't know how to do cross patterning. But it's totally making those connections in your brain that are so great for, focus and concentration. And babies can do it.
Yeah.
You being 40 doesn't excuse you from it.
I think the psychological piece is just huge. Like seeing people literally just like break down, especially in a CrossFit class where they've kind of got conditioned to just go, and kind of have faith in their ability to go. And then all of a sudden, like that coordination quality, like stares them in the face, and they're just, and and that can be really like ego bruising for a lot of people. So much so, like they're just unwilling to even, it's like, oh, like screw this, but like for me, similarly,
athletes take yourselves too seriously.
Yeah, man. No, well, and it's just a reminder too of like of again meeting the client where they're at, and realizing that like everybody, you've mentioned before of like as a coach, back in one of our first episodes where we talked about motivating versus technician, and like how many people are coming to that class and like their whole day they haven't really received any sort of praise or celebration of themselves, and they kind of bring that into that space. And as a coach, sometimes, it's like, look, I'm not bringing this movement out to make you feel bad about yourself, like, let's take this back for a second. Like, it's okay. Like, we'll like that's it for today. And we'll let's move on. We'll revisit this,
Yeah. Or sometimes what I'll do is if I see a student getting really frustrated with the movement, because I'm mostly in group classes, maybe we regress to something I think that they can do as a whole class and then praise. Because, life is hard and we deal with like a lot of negativity. And as coaches, I think we too sometimes need to be somebody's cheerleader.
Yeah.
Like, hey, great job getting your feet in parallel. You're killing it right now.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. Celebrate it.
I think what makes us the people who are drawn to coaching and teaching have the ability to sense when that is what's needed. But also we have all of these different facets and strengths that, hey, I can be creative and come up with stuff. I can also explain it so you know what's going on. And then I can see what our next step is and when we need to take a step back and when I need to give you a pat on the back or when I need to tell you to hurry up because you're being lazy,
Yeah.
The art of coaching
exactly.
Way more nuanced than I think people really appreciate.
Yeah. And that's what like gets me excited about coaching, is the fact that like I can consider myself an artist.
Yes.
Like I'm listening to like I get off to more so now like listening to podcasts of these interviews with these actors or these musicians talking about their process and just the struggle over the years of being in a business that is so cutthroat and so up for grabs and putting yourself out there and rejection and what it means to grow. And for me to like think about that back to my context of coaching is a lot more meaningful and immediately applicable than some of the, heavy details of maybe biomechanics or, nutrition, biochemistry, all to just say that like, there's so many balls that the coach needs to juggle and we need to know, kind of like what are those different dials, in order to, do it a little faster, do it a little slower, come at it from this angle, come at it from that angle. And hopefully have enough time with someone that like you can slowly drop these things in.
Mm-hmm. Well, even just like the sissy squat and the squat variations, if you have an hour with somebody and you can just do a squat 500 different ways and your client's like, oh my gosh, that was so great. I've never experienced hip range of motion and stretch and strength in that way. And all you were thinking of is, well, how can we shake this up?
Right.
And there's a whole hour of content.
Yeah. No, it's so true. It's a good way to remember that, like, you don't need to necessarily have so many bullet points for the lesson plan, but rather, like, just take that one bullet point and continue to play that chord
over and over and over again.
Just like softer, louder, more distortion, less.
Okay, so I didn't play guitar. I mean, you can do that with the piano. This is a total side note. But again, thinking of craft and creativity, I've been watching Mozart in the Jungle
Oh
on
yeah.
Amazon Prime. I
Uh-huh.
strongly recommend it. And it focuses around an oboe player with the New York Symphony. And I played clarinet, which is sort of like the oboe. There's not I guess you could go louder and softer. And I just remember squeaking a lot with the clarinet. But you know what? We could tie this back to coaching. We do all these things that interest us, and they're not always going to be your bread and butter and your main source, and that's okay. But that show, as far as creativity, is so good. It's funny, and I'm like so into classical music right now.
That's awesome.
Yo-Yo Ma is my homeboy.
That's always I love that when something that I didn't, I went to for like different reasons, then like introduces me to something else, and now I'm like the kind of the web of passions is expanding, and
that's when I'm grateful for the fire hose of information the internet has.
Yeah,
it's like when I'm trying to answer a problem or question and I'm getting 500 different opinions, that's when I'm annoyed. But when I'm trying to find the best recording of Mahler's symphony,
yeah, it's out there.
Yay for YouTube.
Well, on that note, we will wrap things up, bringing things completely full circle, kind of, sort of, starting with a little bit of starting with a little bittersweet note on the internet and the inundation of information, and ending with a little more of a gratitude.
Yes.
Relationship to the what we have too easily at our disposal.
My opinion about the internet changes as quickly as the internet changes.
And the internet is grateful for that, because they have many more things to turn you on to.
Yay!
Alexander Ellis, what would you like to leave people with?
Let's hang out. Social media. You can find me at aewellness.com and on Instagram, Twitter, some other stuff at Holla for Mala.
Any quote?
Any quote.
It's okay if you don't have one.
I don't have one today. I got nothing. I just got some classical music on the
Classical
brain.
Music. Do you want to recommend a classical song?
Ooh, I do. Shoot, I need to look up what it is. Yo-Yo Ma has a cello album that is like the greatest hits of all things cello or something like that. And it is so good. I have been fully immersed in it. I'll add it to the
show notes. Okay.
Yeah. It was like, I mean, you just put it on and you fall into, here it is. It's Yo-Yo Ma, Songs from the Arc of Life. It's so, seriously, like, if you like classical music, this is your jam. It is so good.
Awesome. All right. Jared Cohen, can be found at cpbgrowth.com. ITSDERAJ. It's Daraj on Instagram. And I will leave you with this little bit that I heard from the Calm application, meditation application, which is a little paradox on enlightenment. And the student asks their teacher, what is enlightenment? And the teacher responds very succinctly, when you are hungry, eat. When you're tired, sleep. and just like the simplicity of not only listening to your body, but just like, don't make it more complicated. And also when you are engaging in an activity, still be mindful of that process, right? Like, okay, you're hungry, but now, like 20 minutes into the meal, are you still hungry, right? Like, and how we just continue to eat, or we know we're exhausted, and yet, like, I'm still up on the internet looking for some distraction because that is what is temporarily that is what I'm temporarily desiring, in spite of the fact of I'm tired. Just go to sleep.
Go to sleep.
You know.
Keep tuning in.
Keep tuning in.
Staying tuned in to your body in every way.
Every way. All right. Till next time. Adios.
Adios.
Hey guys, thanks for listening to Behind the Podium, Unveiling the Coach. If you have enjoyed what you listened to, head over to iTunes and leave us a review. More information on each episode and the podcast in general can be found at behindthepodiumpodcast.com. We'll catch you next time.